Here we go, example 3. Determine the slope of a line that passes through C, negative 7, 3, and D, 3, 1, without drawing a graph. So on a graph, we could very quickly say, well, let's plot these points. Negative 7, 3 might be up here somewhere, up here somewhere. And then 3, 1, 3, 1 might be over here somewhere. Draw our line and we could count our slope. But it says without drawing a graph. Now, there is a nice fancy formula right down here that we'll talk about in a minute on how we can use this formula to calculate slope, but let's think about what slope is. Okay. I don't like red, I'm going to go to purple. Slope is rise over run, which we also know to be the change in our y values over the change in our x values, or the change in our independent over dependent, whichever way you want to look at it. Now the change in our y values, if we look at our points, this is a y value because we always plot x comma y, x comma y. This is our y value. How do those change from one to the next? 3 changes to 1, or the difference between, so 3 minus 1. And then I could also look at my x values, negative 7 minus 3. Well, that works out to 2 over negative 10, and now I reduce that, it's 1 over negative 5, and I don't like the negative in the bottom, so I move it to the top. Negative 1 over 5 would be my slope. If we drew a graph, we could very quickly plot that out and count the slope in between them. One other thing that we're going to be having or using is our equation here. This is the equation for what we call the slope of a line. Slope of a line, now we're going to start to say, well, slope of a line is equal to m. Okay, little small letter m, which is equal to rise over run, which is equal to this fancy formula below. Now, how to use this fancy formula below? If we have 2 points, an x and a y value from one point and an x and a y value from a second point, that's why there's a 2 here, because this comes from a second point. This comes from the first point, so that's why they're denoted with 1s. If we wanted to calculate the slope between AB, the slope of AB, and you know what, I'm going to change this right now, I'm going to call this m, just because I like to. If we wanted to calculate the slope between AB, then I can use this formula. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. This is the difference in my y values. This is the difference in my x values. Just like I did up here. The difference in my y values and the difference in my x values. Difference of y over difference of x is my slope. So this equation, if I use those same points that we just had from our other equation, our other 2 points, would look a little bit different, but we would still get the same answer. So point 1 was negative 7, 3. Let's go negative 7, 3. And point 2 was 3, 1. So my x1, y1 is negative 7, 3, and my x2, y2 is 3, 1. If I substitute these values, negative 7 for x1, 3 for y1, 3 for x2, and 1 for y2 into this formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, you'll see what kind of calculation I get. So y2 is 1, y1 is 3, over x2 is 3, x1 negative 7. Remember, you're subtracting, so it's minus a negative 7. I'm going to erase that, make that a little bit better. Minus a negative 7. Okay. Now I simply calculate. Well, 1 minus 3 is 2. 3 minus a negative 7 becomes 3 plus a positive 7, which is 10. So this is negative 2. This is 10, which again reduces to negative 1 over 5. So we get exactly the same answer, although we've come about getting there a little bit differently. Okay? Still exactly the same answer. Okay? This formula, rise over run, the way it's written, we're going to use later for a couple of different things, so you need to get used to using this formula. For some students it gets a little tricky because it's a little bit different, but what I do is whenever I'm given 2 points, the first thing I always do, and if I'm trying to calculate slope, if I give, let's just randomly say 2 points, 2, 5, and negative 3, 0. Randomly given 2 points, calculate the slope between the two. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, this was my first point that I was given. I'm going to call this x1, y1. This is the second point I was given. I'm going to call this x2, y2. Now I have those values that I can substitute into that slope formula. Okay? So whenever I'm given 2 points and asked to calculate the slope, I always write down that little x1, y1, x2, y2. And if you ask me questions and you need some help with this stuff, then that's going to be one of the first things I tell you to do too. Because that once you've got that done, then you can very simply substitute into this formula and then easily calculate slope. Okay, so that's the end of 6.1. Questions here at the bottom of the page noted. Remember, the only way you can get better at this stuff is to practice, practice, practice.